Dron, a magnificent manoeuvre.
And looks at the inside and goes through. A superb move on the inside.
In the capable hands of racing journalist Tony Dron, their efforts are forcing not a few to sit up and take note.
Bell takes a corner wide, and Dron forces through.
Tony Dron right on the left-hand side of the track. He's used every inch, and look at the time.
You notice how smooth Dron is, the true mark of a very experienced and competent driver.
This is going to be a great victory for Tony Dron.
I've never been frightened at the time. It's quite simple to explain this. What happens is before you get into the car and drive it, you get a build-up of adrenaline, and you go a bit quiet, and you don't want to talk to people very much. Particularly in something like Formula 3, where the competition's really tight, and half a second a lap can make all the difference between glory and total disaster. There's no further capacity for shock.
The real world of motor racing. A glamorous, exciting world which holds a magnetic attraction for the men and the women who live for speed. A world where danger lurks at every bend with every turn of the wheel.
Maybe it's a sense of inverted escapism. It seems to me to be that this is the real world where everything makes sense. And when I get out and open a letter from my bank manager, I can break out in a cold sweat over that.
You just get faster and faster. You go through levels, you think, I'm now going as fast as I can in this car. You discover another little level.
Tony Dron tucked in behind.
I always thought you could learn more about someone's character if you could very clearly read the word Hewland on the back of his gearbox.
Tony Dron has a little think about going inside him.
You'll be able to tell when I've retired. They'll nail the lid in the box and burn it. I tend to keep going as long as I can.
Fine, nice easy. Then this old bloke Derek Bell comes charging up and catches up with me. He got too exuberant at this last corner on the circuit here and all but lost it, hurling it in, you know. Thought he'd got it made, well he had. It just gave me the brake I needed to get back in front.
My good friend Bruce Johnson, we started going to see the Grand Prix. We went in 1965, a year after we left school. We went to see the German Grand Prix on the old Nürburgring. Absolute revelation, fantastic experience. I saw Jim Clark set pole position by 10 seconds. And we were the only people watching and qualifying. Grand Prix racing was a very different thing then. And he came through those bends in the woods, and the car was just gliding through like that. His use of the steering and the throttle was electric, but the car just glided through really fast. And I thought, I've just got to do this. This is fantastic. The most amazing thing I've ever seen.
It's hard to pick out one car from all the ones I've ever raced. The Porsche 934 was a pretty remarkable car with 625 brake horsepower and a pretty well standard 911 turbo body. That was timed at over 200 down the straight at Le Mans. We won the class there in, I think, 82.
My coach and mentor for that day was racing journalist Tony Dron.
Right, what I'm trying to show you here, Dickie, is the importance of taking very smooth lines. You must brake and change gear in a straight line and turn into the corner in a very smooth line.
Tony Dron applies the power. He's right on the limit. Inch perfect at 65, 70 miles an hour. Hard onto the power, out of the semicircle. Tony Dron right on the left-hand side of the track. He's used every inch, and look at the time, beating even Gwyndaf Evans by 0.2 of a second.
Well, Tony, what a terrific rally. Could I have a word with you for a second?
Yeah.
Congratulations to start off with.
Thanks very much.
What do you think about the rally?
Yeah. Obviously, anything that you win is terrific fun.
This is the formation lap to come onto the grid. Check all the instruments and keep calm. But if you want to know the truth about what I'm really thinking now, it's what I've been thinking in every race I've done since 1968 when I started, which is, what on earth am I doing here? Oh God, I'll just do this one more.
A tremendous race this. Really, really good, close racing.
on the inside as they go into St Mary's. You see his brake lights come on very, very late. He's doing absolutely everything he can to unsettle Tiffany Dell, and looks at the inside and goes through. A superb move on the inside as here comes Tony Dron into Woodcote Corner for the final time. Oh, getting a little bit on the grass. Coming down into the chicane for the final time on the brakes. Flick down the gear lever, on the power now. Accelerating out of the chicane. The checkered flag is waiting. This is going to be a great victory for Tony Dron, who wins in the 1962 4-6 Ferrari.
I was really crossing my fingers. And the last lap, I backed off a little and I very nearly went off. just put two wheels on the grass down there. It shows you should just keep going.
That's the old Goodwood commentary. He's on the grass, he's off the grass.
God, it was fun.
I thought that was a wonderful race, I must say. He deserved to win that. How the devil Tony made that Ferrari go that well with only 2.4 litres, it is quite amazing.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this splendid building, the home of the British Racing Drivers Club. It is entirely fitting that we should be here in the club of which Tony was so very proud to be a member. It is my extraordinarily daunting privilege to host, on behalf of Caris and Tony's family, the celebration of the life of Tony Dron. Racing driver, journalist, father, mentor and friend. It's daunting not just because of the tremendous breadth of Tony's life, his passions, experiences and friendships, nor just because the room is full of such eminent wordsmiths, but because Tony is undoubtedly frowning down on us right now, wondering what on earth the fuss is all about. Sorry, Tony. Now, you're going to hear shortly from Jonathan Palmer, from Ian Young and from Will Dron. After that, please stay around, light lunch, and there's some of Tony's favourite beer being laid on, which probably explains the presence of at least one or two of you in the room, no doubt. It should come as no surprise to anybody here that Tony's upbringing was not the most conventional. Born into a distinctly comfortably off family, one can imagine an upbringing full of adventure and excitement. The ability to purchase his first car, an Austin 7 of 1937 vintage, at the tender age of 11, and then encouraged by his father to turn it into a SpeedX Special, is not the childhood many will have experienced. Nonetheless, this undoubtedly fueled his passion, not just for motor cars, but for an appreciation of the engineering that goes behind them. And with an animal-loving mother and a garden full of free-range guinea pigs, it's no surprise he developed his own deep love of animals, with a particular passion for cats, but also became known for his ability to work with and soothe wayward pets, earning him the sobriquet of the hamster wrangler. However, into every life a little rain must fall, and this charmed lifestyle was not to last. The collapse of the family business when in his late teens, and the end of the comfortable lifestyle that it supported, is the sort of shock that I think many youngsters would struggle to ever recover from. And that Tony took this shattering change in circumstance in his stride is impossible, frankly, I think, to comprehend, but is an enormous credit to his strength of character. And one final hope of inheritance from an aunt was dashed when she chose to leave her estate to the Salvation Army. One can only imagine the words that were shared on his way home from hearing the news when being accosted by a fellow with a bucket collecting for the Salvation Army. It's no doubt, though, that it is this upbringing that would have given Tony that remarkable set of principles by which he lived his life, and the high standards that he set himself and expected from others. It's hard to say which came first into Tony's adult life, motor racing or journalism. He'd been thrashing his Austin 7 Special around the family garden as a lad, and as we just heard, he'd been at the Nürburgring to watch Jim Clark win in '65. But his first job actually came from a family friend's introduction to the great Innis Island. First man to win a Grand Prix for Lotus, and later, of course, president of this very BRDC. And as every right-minded person knows, long-time enthusiastic owner of a 3-litre Bentley. Tony had clearly made the decision that he wanted to go racing, and Formula Ford looked the obvious option. By the late 60s, Innes Ireland was sports editor of Autocar, and by all accounts, a pretty formidable fellow. And it speaks volumes that the young Dron impressed Ireland sufficiently to be interviewed over lunch at the Steering Wheel Club, where Innes could see Tony's potential as a race reporter, as he intended to be racing at all of the club meetings that needed to be covered. And what ensued from such modest aspirations was, of course, a most extraordinary twin career in motorsport and in journalism. From these humble beginnings, Tony, of course, went on to become road test editor for Motor, long-time editor of Classic Cars, regular contributor to the Daily Telegraph, and of course, latterly to Octane magazine, amongst many, many, many others. And of Tony, the racing driver. Well, 1968 brought him into Formula Fords, racing against the likes of James Hunt, went on to become a very great friend. 73, 74, 75 in the Avon Tour of Britain. I think only Tony could have pulled off persuading his sponsors and bosses that his navigator needed to be a penthouse pet. Fair play to him, I have to say. I really do admire that. 1977, of course, an incredible year when he was a works driver for Triumph in the British Saloon Car Championship, taking the fight to the mighty Capri's and ultimately missing out on the championship by just that single point at the end of a heck of a year. 1978, Porsche 924 champion. 1980, works Porsche drive at Le Mans with Andy Rouse. 1982, class winner at Le Mans, Porsche 934. 1983, will hire 24 Hours in a team with Andy Rouse, Wyn Percy and Phil Dowsett. In later life, of course, Tony found a welcoming home for his talent in the world of historic motorsport. As we've just seen, 2001, 2 and 3, he won the Sussex Trophy at the Goodwood Revival in that fabulous 246S Dino. And of course, podiums in our own Le Mans Legend race supporting the 24 Hours in 2003 and 2009. And I have to say, I think it speaks volumes that 3 of those winning cars are sitting outside as I speak. And we're going to hear in a moment a glimpse from Tony's early racing career and an insight into his abilities to motivate, encourage, and mentor others. The online tributes are chock full of tales of how Tony gave them their first break in journalism or helped them in their racing. And it all makes for pretty humbling reading that he was held in such affection by so many folk. Tony's greatest strength was his ability to combine an exceptionally thorough approach to everything that he applied himself to, yet always with an air of humility and good humour. He had an enduring respect for his race mechanics and utterly appreciated the importance of their role in the team. He was deadly serious about his racing. He once gave me a serious rollicking after sharing my car at Donington after I told him to keep off the curbs, only for him to find the internet full of images of me all over the curbs and my lap times just that tiny bit quicker than his. He was not happy. But otherwise, he was always happy to laugh about himself. He could spend weeks researching an article for a magazine. He would walk every inch of a circuit to be sure he knew exactly how he could get the best from it. And I'm even told that the kitchen was best avoided when he was cooking the Sunday roast. And he applied that same thoroughness to his very many friendships, all of which he took very seriously. But no matter what he was doing, he was always the same, no matter who you were. And that he could get as much genuine pleasure in his later years from the Austin 7 saloon, currently parked outside, as he did as an 11-year-old boy, after a lifetime at the top of the motoring and motorsport world, is truly astonishing. Here is a man who climbed the highest peaks of motor racing's mountains through his determined and thorough approach, who established himself as one of Britain's great motoring writers, who could be stern and frankly rather daunting on occasions with his depth of thought and his erudition, and yet at the same time could be the most thoroughly entertaining company, from roguish schoolboy humour to stimulating, informed and thoughtful debate, and always best served over a pint of beer. And I'd like to finish my little piece by paraphrasing something that was written by Andrew Frankel on hearing of Tony's passing back in November. It's a beautifully eloquent piece, quite rightly more a celebration than an obituary, that utterly captured the spirit of the man. And Andrew finished his piece by saying this: "My fondest memory of Tony was at the 2010 Le Mans Classic, where he and I were on the same grid. I was in a reasonably rapid vintage Bentley, he in a 1923 Ford Model T, which must surely be the slowest car ever to have raced at Le Mans. So after a while, I came up to lap him. I caught him coming out of Tertre Rouge and drew alongside, watching him hunched over the wheel as if doing so would somehow have a material effect on the aero efficiency of a Model T doing 60 miles an hour at best. But when he saw me, he sat up, he looked across, and even through his helmet and balaclava, I could see that he was laughing his head off. And rightly so, for this was not a moment to be taken seriously. I wanted to enjoy it too, so I lifted off, and for a few magical seconds we raced side by side along the Mulsanne Straight, waving and pointing raised thumbs at each other. And what I found so moving and instructive was that this was not just some amateur mate of mine who couldn't believe his luck at having been able to compete in a relatively unimportant race at Le Mans. This was a man who'd raced at Le Mans in 1980 as a factory Porsche driver and won his class there 2 years later. Yet there he was, crawling towards the first chicane in this arthritic antique contraption, hooting with laughter, apparently having the best time in the world. After the race, he came up to me and reminded me that those were moments to be savoured and cherished. Moments in which to remember how lucky we were to do what we do and to never ever take for granted. Like so many others, I'll miss Tony terribly, but far more than that, I'll be grateful forever, simply that I knew the bloke. Our world is poorer by far without him." Andrew, perfect sentiment. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd now like to invite Jonathan Palmer up here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Duncan. I might just take this out, actually. It might be slightly easier. As you said, lovely to see so many people here on this very special occasion, actually. It's, of course it is. And as you said, the BRDC Clubhouse is the very place that this once after a lifetime occasion should take place. Now, Tony actually played a huge part in my early motor racing days, and that's something for which I will always be eternally grateful. As some of you will know, I started originally as a medical student back in 1987. I took myself up to Guy's Hospital as a 17-year-old medical student, had to find somewhere to live, and I found a house in Honor Oak Park in southeast London, and one of about 6 or 8 students of various sorts in this house. And at this point, I've not gone racing at all. The near one I'd got, I think I took myself off to Brands Hatch to do the initial trial where at Brands Hatch, where a chap called Sid Fox, that many of you will remember, Sid Fox took me around, or I took him around in a Escort, Mexico or something, no doubt. And he gave me a little chit that said 91%, too fast for first time, but lots of potential. So that was all I'd done when I arrived at London. I was an impoverished medical student. I had no money at all, you know, and my father was a GP who'd not been racing at all, although I did bully him into being a circuit doctor. So really, I knew nothing about motor racing, how to go racing. It wasn't anything like the guys today who started karting and even my good friend Martin Brundle, who was into sort of stock car racing and hot rods and stuff. You know, I knew nothing about it. Now, what I did know is that I needed to find people who understood motor racing, and I could encourage to spend some money and try and help me with my motor racing. And as a lot of drivers do, one thing you do with people, you actually when you meet somebody, what car have they got? And 2 of these guys that were just about to qualify as dentists in this house I was renting, one had an MGC, a chap called Dave Cocker, and one had a Jensen Healey. So I thought, well, here's two people that actually, clearly, they're about to qualify, they're about to become loaded, and these are definitely potential victims for me to sort of suck into the help support and help JP somehow campaign. Julie, I did manage to convince one of them, Dave Mercer, who some of you will know, and he's still a good friend, to go half shares on my first car, a 325-pound Austin Healey Sprite. So I rustled up 162 pounds to do that, and then moved on from there to the Marcus. But of course, what I really wanted to do, and I worked that much out, was to get into Formula 4, but I knew nothing again about racing. But I was soon to meet Tony Dron. And actually, he's best to tell you how. And that's not because he's been kidding us and is behind the curtain or something, or there's another bit of video here. But that's because about a year ago, Tony sent me some copy he'd written, which had intended to be part of his memoirs. Now, some of you, I mean, I guess Will knows much more about that and where that's all at, but I'll just read to you what he put, because it's best, he can tell you in his own words. So this is in his chapter 51, so there's a lot more before this. Everything was on the line again. Had I failed to get a decent drive for 1977, any momentum that existed in my racing career would have been lost for all time. I knew that very well, but there was nothing on offer. I needed a drive, desperately, yet I felt strangely relaxed. Perhaps I was growing up, but that seems unlikely. Early in that new year, my aim was to find another drive in Formula 3, but with a competitive engine, ideally a Toyota Nova motor behind me this time. Everybody in that position back then prepared a proposal in the form of a folder that could be copied and presented to any likely backers. These proposals were split into sections, summarizing the deal on offer with information about the intended championship, the car that we were going to buy with the new sponsor's money, the biographical details of the incredibly promising driver, the enormous benefits that would make all the difference to any business wise enough to put up the cash, and of course, the big fat budget to run the whole show. By mid-January, unsurprisingly, this brilliant piece of work of mine had produced not the slightest spark of interest from any quarter. The master of the art of racing sponsorship in those days was a certain Guy Edwards, who seemed to come up with the goods every time, while my efforts in that direction were pathetic. To be honest, I prepared those proposals as an act of faith, thinking that even if they never worked, the very act of creating them kept my mind in the right place, and something good would happen somehow. In 1977, the best that can be said is that I believed in myself as a driver, but at 30 years of age, I probably knew deep down that my future in single-seaters, especially Formula 3 cars, was a lost cause. Although I could not bring myself to see it that way at the time, there were better opportunities in other branches of the sport for a driver in my position. Meanwhile, I did my best to make myself conspicuously available as a driver, keep fit by playing a hell of a lot of squash, and went from day to day hoping that something would turn up. Oddly enough, it always did, for the next 35 years in a huge variety of cars. At that time, I lived in Blackheath, southeast London. And one day I went for a routine checkup with the trendy local dental practice. For obvious reasons, I've always made a point of being more than polite to dentists. I even try to find out what interests them so I can engage them in friendly conversation. It's exactly the same with mechanics. It does seem a good idea to get on well with dentists and mechanics. Once you're in the chair, feeling vulnerable with your mouth stuffed full of alarming equipment, the dentist is in full control. If he requests some favour at that point, you are likely to agree to almost anything, just to keep him friendly and on your side. That was the situation in Joe Eisenberg's dental practice in Blackheath. One day in the winter of 1976-7, I was in the chair and Mr. Eisenberg's young student dentist, David Cocker, was carrying out some task on my teeth. "I wonder if you could do me a favour," said the young Cocker in his most friendly voice. "Gah!" I grunted in an attempt to say, "Of course, anything." Seeming to interpret that as a positive response, he went on, "My flatmate is a medical student and he wants to start motor racing. I wonder if you'd be happy to meet him and give him a few pointers." Had anyone else asked that question, I admit I would probably have made some excuse and refused. On this occasion, however, there was no getting out of it. Soon after I got home, the phone rang, and the dentist's young flatmate asked if he could come round that evening. A time at 7:30 was agreed, and he turned up on the dot. Unexpectedly, there was something about this 19-year-old lad that made me take him seriously. He talked sense, he was polite, didn't waffle, and he was obviously bright. Not a complete beginner. He'd already done a few races in a modified Sprite that he shared with a friend, and what he said about his efforts to date sounded most convincing. Reaching for one of my latest sponsorship proposals, I handed it to him and explained what it was all about. At the end of the little talk, I added, mind you, it never works. I just do that to keep my morale up. Good luck. 2 weeks later, he was back saying, I've got the money to do my Formula Ford Championship and I'm expecting to get more backing from another sponsor next week. How the hell did you do that? I asked. I copied your proposal, just changing it as required. Where it said Formula 3, I put my details in, and where it had your name, I put mine in, and so and so. You mean, I said in disbelief, that stupid proposal actually worked? Yes. Bloody hell, I muttered. I'm obviously not trying hard enough. His name was Jonathan Palmer. He will crop up again in my story, partly as a great godfather to my son born in 1981. But I can say one more thing here and now about JP. He never really needed the slightest bit of advice from me. I've been one of his fans ever since. Now, needless to say, I was also a great fan of Tony's. But was far more than that. I was actually starstruck by this guy because, imagine me, I've known nothing about motor racing. I've been grabbing out these tatty old sports cars at the back, not at the back, actually at the front, but in Motorsports racings. But the idea of a single-seater was something I knew nothing about. And here I was starstruck by this guy who was driving in professional driver, Formula 3, had a lot of swagger, confidence, good-looking guy, had a lot of chat, and of course he was also going on to be a top touring car driver as well. In fact, the Unipart F3 car was one of the great livered cars actually. I don't know, is John Neal? Is John Neal here? No. But of course, what enhanced Tony's image even more and made me even more starstruck was that he was actually very famous. And as an avid reader of Motor Magazine, I'd been reading his words for most years and years and years. So here was a guy who I'd heard of, read his stuff, and he was running in a top manufacturer team, and he was seeing me. So that was fantastic. But to my excitement, Tony very much took me under his wing. We'd have many evenings in his flat at Blackheath. I was 4 or 5 miles away in Honor Oak Park, just talking about motor racing. And again, I was only just starting Formula Ford, let alone getting any more than that. But there was very much more to it, to him than that. And he had amazing amount of generosity. Whenever he would be going somewhere on an interesting trip, maybe he was going to Broadspeed or going to Unipart, the factory, he'd invite me along. And he took me along, whether he was testing. If I was available, he said, come on, jump in the car. And we go off to Silverstone here, or we go off to Abingdon to see the cars. And he'd always introduce me to people, and I was pretty overwhelmed with this, but it was wonderful. The time he took was absolutely fantastic. And actually, I just reminded of another element of that. Ian Flux just reminded me that actually we were leaning over the wall at Brands Hatch, and it was Tony Dron who would introduce me to Ian Flux at the time as well. Good job I didn't take too much heed of whatever happened after that, but he's that kind of guy. And for that I'm extremely grateful, and he taught me so much of that. But it wasn't just the visits that were special with Tony. It wasn't just him saying, come to this place or that place, and watching the team and things like that. It was also how we got there. Because, of course, Tony being a top star racing driver, he had a works car, of course, a road car, which was another thing that made him very special in my eyes. Admittedly, the fact that it was a Morris Marina, probably it doesn't sound that impressive. But actually, of course, because it was Tony, it wasn't any Morris Marina. When he was told he was going to have a Morris Marina, he looked into it very carefully, as Tony would. Now, as you'll all remember, Morris Marinas, I'm sure, came in a 1300 and an 1800, and I think Steve Copley will remind me actually over there. There's a TC as well, and it was the 1800 TC, of course, that Tony had. But Tony had worked out, looking at the specifications and of these cars, that he could have had the saloon. Coupe was a bit more racy on the face of it, but as a road tester, he knew they understeered, and that wasn't good. That wasn't going to make it a fun means of transport. But looking further at the specs, he found that the estate actually had stiffer rear springs, clearly to carry the load, and tried that and found that that was indeed the perfectly balanced Morris Marina. So that's what we had, or he had, and that's what we used to go hammering up on these trips on. I can still remember it. I can still remember the journeys now. And indeed, I can actually testify that the balance of a Morris Marina estate is pretty damn good. And in the hands of T. Dron Esquire, it made very effective transport. To his credit, I never thought any trip was going to be my last. But actually, like it had really good drivers. He was so elegant to watch. His driving in a road car, even. I didn't sat beside him in a racing car. Some of you will have done. But even in the road car, his fluid style, the sensitive driving that he had, was really quite exceptional. And we all know, I'm sure, a lot of people are clumsy in cars and a bit jerky and abrupt. But Tony was the absolute epitome of smoothness, elegance, fluidity, sensitivity. And I'm sure that those skills that he had in that area have made him, or went on to make him, an exceptional driver for historics and somebody who could get the best out of those sort of cars. But also, as well as doing that, he could also be relied upon not to break somebody else's car as well, which of course is equally important to be trusted in. So driving with him was a treat. But another thing that actually, one of the other things that, a little bit of fun that Tony made an impression on me, was with colours. He chose for his Morris Marina estate Tahiti blue. Does anyone remember? I'm pretty sure it's called Tahiti blue. So I duly thought this was, again, I was in awe of Tony Dron, deeply grateful to him. And so I thought, well, that's the cool colour. So I adopted Tahiti blue for my Marcus, and then I adopted it for my racing helmet when I started Formula 3, 201. And it even carries on in a slightly evolved way with my helicopter. So that's another thing that I owe Tony Dron the credit for. Now then, I then obviously moved away from London and we went in different directions. But Tony was always a very, very special friend, and it was always lovely catching up. Indeed, I spent a lot of time with his brother Peter here when we did live close together playing squash. Rather irritatingly, Peter was usually better than me, but both at drinking beer. Huh? Always, yeah. But you probably weren't as nice about beating me as Tony would have been. But anyway, we always really enjoyed catching up, and it was also a great. I was very proud to be godfather to Will, and I'm sure I was as useless as any other godfather normally is. But it's been a very special relationship, and we loved doing that. And actually, most recently, about a year ago, I wanted there's a certain classic car I wanted to buy, and I just thought, who's the chap to ask? So I asked Tony to go and bid on that, which he did successfully for me, which was the last time that we really had anything close together doing. But above all, in summary, that I so appreciated the fact that Tony gave me so much time when I was just yet another spotty kid with dreams of doing the virtually impossible. His generosity was exceptional. And I think the legacy for me of Tony is that fact that helping people and giving people an opportunity when they're just starting to do something, and giving a bit of a leg up when they might just make good full use of it. In fact, that sort of approach is in a way what I enjoy doing now. Out on the track, we've got our GB3 championship, single-seater championship, and GB4. And partnered, I'm delighted to say, by the BRDC, and that's all part of the same sort of ethos, I think. Now, Tony was a great racing driver, a wonderful writer, and quite the gentleman, and a wonderfully generous person, and it was a real privilege to have known him. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you. There you are. Jonathan Palmer, the only man with a helicopter painted Marina blue. Ladies and gentlemen, Ian Young.
Thank you, Duncan. I tell you, I find it slightly ironic, actually, that I'm standing here, rather daunted, in this unique setting, feeling completely out of my depth. Because getting me to do things I didn't think I could do, to write articles I didn't feel qualified to write, well, that was definitely one of Tony's preferred mentoring methods during my days at Classic Cars magazine. It's not that he forced me. He had too much class to be heavy-handed or unreasonable. There would just be a particular look, intense, concentrated, deadly serious, and his voice would just drop a little bit deeper and grow very quiet. And you felt immediately as if you were being tasked with writing the most important article the magazine would ever publish. And of course, you would agree to get on with it right away and would be rewarded with a small smile and a glint in the eye and the words, "Good stuff." And you'd walk away feeling like $1 million, possibly even believing that you were, after all, the right man for the job. Such was Tony's unique ability to encourage, to motivate, and above all, to inspire. So, although I do find myself feeling today like a novice journalist again, I'm also hugely grateful to Caris for giving me an opportunity to say a few words about the Classic Cars days, of which Tony was editor for a decade. So I use the word mentoring very deliberately, for although I'm fairly sure my 21-year-old self wouldn't have credited him with that role at the time, that is, of course, what he was, my mentor, a trusted advisor who gave freely of his considerable experience and wisdom. A friend. I would never have dared to call him that. I was too much in awe. We all have unique perspectives, of course, but I don't think it's fanciful to suggest that those of us who worked at Classic Cars magazine while Tony was at the helm lived an unspoken agreement that our leader was someone special. He was an authentic English gentleman with impeccable style, a razor-sharp intellect, and a terrier's nose for excellent public houses, serving good quality real ale. But I have to confess, I do feel something of an imposter here, surrounded by so many of Tony's long-standing friends and colleagues. Because our time actually working together at Classic Cars lasted barely 2 years. But if I can stake a claim to speak on behalf of any particular demographic, then perhaps it's on behalf of all the young writers he encouraged. For although we all know Tony was pretty skilled behind the wheel of a motor car, what can be missed behind the glitz and the glamour of those achievements is the quality of the man who sat quietly in the editor's chair, listening to our harebrained ideas, carefully reading the crude first drafts of our copy, and then with absolute clarity and precision, employing, I can only guess, the sort of dexterity that must have been required to navigate the Nordschleife in driving rain. He would guide and mentor us, not as a racing driver who occasionally wrote about his experiences, but as a writer who understood and embraced the power of the pen to lift us all to new realms of imagination and enjoyment. The automobile might have been Tony's muse, oil-stained, demanding, unpredictable, but his love of the craft of writing was as passionate and as enduring as any great partnership in literature. And rather like the driving, he made it look effortless. And it was only over time that I began to realize that he was grafting over his copy with the same intensity as any of us, that he shared the same fanatical determination to find the right words, to adopt the right tone, and that he was, like all of us, plagued by self-doubt about his skill as a writer. One morning in particular stands out. I had come into the office early, hoping to use the quiet time to finish some copy. And I found Tony standing at the printer, uncharacteristically disheveled, head bowed, poring over a page of text with such fierce concentration that he barely noticed my presence. I was struck by the fact that his shirt wasn't tucked in and his tie was loose. This was unheard of for Tony, particularly at the start of a working day. Eventually he looked up, apparently satisfied with what he'd read, and he announced, rather wearily to me, that James Hunt had died. And I'm slightly ashamed to say that this news had limited impact on me, as someone who was only 5 years old when Hunt won his World Championship. And I had no idea that he and Tony had been contemporaries. But what did hit me was the effect the news had had on him. He told me that he'd heard late the night before and immediately begun work on an obituary for a range of different publications. He'd spent the night in his office, catnapping on the floor, in between endless drafts and redrafts, rough carving, sculpting, and finally polishing his words until he was satisfied with the finished product. Deadlines loomed, and he was clearly exhausted by a contortion of emotions: grief at the unexpected death of a friend and fellow competitor, determination to find the right words that would capture the essence of an extraordinary life, and shock at this sudden end for a man who was of similar age to him. It was one of those rare occasions when I saw him look properly shell-shocked, and where the twin passions of racing and writing came together in the most testing of circumstances. But Tony's enthusiasm for journalism was not just inspiring, it was infectious. And I soon found myself pitching up for work each morning, long before my contract required, and staying late into the evening while the bars and pubs of the South Bank beckoned beneath us. And I was not the only one moved to burn the candle at both ends. I suppose you could say that we staffers, particularly the younger ones, well, we were all in a bit of a race of our own, driven by a shared desire to produce the sort of magazine that met with Tony's stratospherically high standards on the racetrack. Now, of course, some might have scoffed that we were not real journalists at all, that we were just a ragtag crew of train-spotting anoraks, marooned on the 24th floor of IPC magazines, somewhere between the supermodels and the carp fishermen, poring over chassis serial numbers and comparing engine capacities. And to some extent, they might have had a point. But one of Tony's many skills was to nurture within us the sense that what we were doing was truly important, that our road tests, our investigations, our interviews not only provided our readers with information and entertainment, and even, on occasion, good advice, but that it also served as a contemporary, unbiased prism through which we could explore the history of industry and, inevitably, the evolution of much of Western culture through the 20th century. And as so often happens in the media, the greatest strengths of the publication were a reflection of the very same qualities that lived most powerfully in its editor: meticulous attention to detail, absolute loyalty to the truth, and an astute, self-deprecating sense of humor. Now, in the rushed years of my 20s and early 30s, jobs for me came and went, and the moments of contact between us grew further and further apart as I married, started a family of my own, and ultimately moved overseas and away from journalism entirely. I know I should have tried harder to stay in touch, but by then I was so completely focused on a teaching career that the classic cars years started to fade into the hinterland of my youth, like a fairy tale, the details of which grow hazy and indistinct. I know there was a magician in the tale, because I sat next to him in a rally car and I saw the way he steered a 50-foot canal boat. But I also know that the magician was a king, because I spent the next 20-plus years expecting to find a boss that would advise and encourage and inspire me in the way that Dron did. And I didn't. He was truly unique. Thank you.
Ian, a beautifully eloquent piece. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to hand the floor over now to Will Dron. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know how to follow that. It's extraordinary. I have a few bits of housekeeping to do, but the family would just like to thank everyone who's spoken today. So Duncan, thank you so much for your kind words today, but also for being such a great help behind the scenes. It's really been fantastic to have you on board. And creating the Tony Dron trophy is just an extraordinary honour that lives on. Jonathan, thank you again so much. I haven't actually ever heard the story of how you guys met and all that stuff, so that's good to hear. But he had the greatest respect for you, enough respect to ask you to be my godfather. So I won there. So, but it's wonderful words. Thank you very much. And Ian, extraordinary words again. Thank you so much. And I always thought of you as the coolest guy at Classic Cars magazine, because I remember I went to a few shoots and with various classic cars, and you were on one, and I remember you had an Austin Healey 3000, and yeah, right. We went to the pub for lunch, of course, and I remember getting a passenger ride, and I just thought you were outstandingly cool. But thank you all so much for your time today. So I do want to share a couple of my own memories of Dad. I found out a lot about him since following him into motoring journalism. Dad told me not to be a motoring journalist, not to be a journalist at all like him or Uncle Peter. He said instead I should make some money and become a gentleman racer. I buggered that one up, but it is a great fun career. And I meet people who have worked with Dad. We didn't cross over during our times in motoring journalism, but there are obviously people in the industry who worked with Dad and worked with me. And a lot of people say to me that nurturing thing, the younger guys saying, oh, your dad was fantastic. And although I was new on the scene, he shared a car with me, and he was a wonderful bloke to sit beside and just learn from. And a lot of people were in awe of him and just thought he just was a kind bloke who always helped nurture them. One guy I work with now, a guy called Malcolm Griffiths, he's a photographer, and he worked with Dad. He was in awe of Dad. He went to the Nürburgring and had a ride around the Nordschleife with Dad, and just thought he was an outstandingly cool guy. But what I learned from Dad was two things. From Malky was two things. Dad would always organise a photo shoot near a pub, which I never do, and yeah, Malky always feels let down on that part. But also, Dad was a true gent and never called him a bellend, which I have been known to do. I spent a lot of time at race circuits in my youth, of course. I generally and genuinely expected Dad to be at the top of the timesheets all the time, and it was a surprise to me when he wasn't. I think that's probably just something to do with your expectations of your father, but fortunately Dad was pretty good, so he didn't often let me down. He did have a silly side. Anyone who's seen him after dyeing his hair green can attest to that. But at the race circuit, he was generally deadly serious, and I remember he would go into a motorhome before races and spend about half an hour in there just on his own, door locked, and he would visualise the entire race from start to finish. And I think that was probably quite a good technique. He was very well respected, which was annoying when I was a kid, because it would take about 2 hours to get from one side of a paddock to another, and I'd be tugging at his race suit saying, "Daddy, I'm hungry, I just want a burger." But yeah, he was stopped by everyone, and he always had time for people, which was one of his true strengths. I was very proud of him, actually, of course, as you can tell, and I remember one time he was in the Porsche. He was in a Porsche 911 in the Porsche series, and started at, it was at Brands Hatch, and the race started, he was in the front row, and he was pushed off at the first corner at Paddock Hill Bend and ended up in the gravel trap. And he didn't often end up in the gravel trap and didn't often crash, so this was quite an extraordinary moment for me. But I was on the outside of the corner looking through the fence, and he got out of the car, and I said, "Dad, Dad," because I was so proud of him. I wanted everyone around to know that he was my dad. Of course, he was not in the best of moods, but he waved at me and trudged through the gravel. But people asked back then and ask now if I race. And Dad's stock answer was he needed a richer father. And there's some truth in that, but what I've realised in later life is that actually the truth of the matter is that I would like to race, but Dad needed to race. That's what he really needed to do. To him, it was life. A few years ago, I got an email from a PR at Lego, and they said, it was quite a cryptic email. They said, "Do you have any racing heroes?" I said, well, I thought there's something going on here. Obviously, they want to send me a model or something, so I thought, well, I'll make it easy for them. Ayrton Senna, who was a hero of mine, but I thought I'll throw them a curveball. My dad, Tony Dron. And he said, right, okay. And a couple of weeks later, I got a package through the post. And it was a little Lego model of my dad, complete with race suit and sponsor badges and things. And that is one of my favourite possessions. I think it's just absolutely brilliant. They got the hair almost right, but it's not green. Yeah, they said, extraordinary, they said, would it be all right if we put it on the shop so that other people can buy it? And I said, I'm not sure who else is going to want to buy it. I know there was one person who bought it, Karis. Two? Oh, right, okay. But yeah, I'll just wrap up. Dad was, as a gent, as everyone said, he was a great journalist, he was a proper racer, but he was, to me, just the coolest dad in the world. So we have a few bits of housekeeping. First, I'd like to call up my sisters Amy and Katy just to say a few thank yous on behalf of the family.
Thank you, Will. Absolutely lovely to share those memories with us. Thank you. It's such a moving and fitting tribute to Dad. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here today, and thank you for helping make this such a special occasion. Thank you, Karis, for all your hard work making this happen, and Karen for your amazing help and support. The family would like to thank everyone who has made this memorial service possible, including all the generous people who contributed to the Just Giving Fund. A special mention must go to Adrian Beecroft, Gregor Fiskin, Simon Kidston and Julius Thurgood.
So it's really lovely to be here today and hear all of your stories, and thanks again to everyone who's written such wonderful obituaries and memories of Dad, and many thanks to everyone who has facilitated having some very special cars from Dad's career in life with us here today. Thank you to Harry Leventis and Tim Samways for bringing the Ferrari 246 Dino, Andy Prill for bringing Tony's Porsche 924 championship winning car, Porsche of Great Britain for shipping Dad's 1980 Le Mans 924 GTP from the Porsche Museum in Germany, especially for this event, Chris Garner, Robert Lee, Hugh Barnes, and the Cambridge Austin 7 and Vintage Car Club for rebuilding the engine of Dad's Austin 7 and teaching Karis to drive it.
Yeah, and we're relying on you on getting some tips for that one, Karis. Thank you very much. Thanks to Alexander Whitcombe of Whitcombe and James for creating the fabulous short compilation film at the start of the memorial, and Jeff Bloxham for allowing us to use the photos. And of course, the British Racing Drivers Club. especially Adam Berkshire, for outstanding help and support in arranging this celebration of Tony's life. Dad and we were so proud of his membership of this place, and we can think of no better venue for his send-off. So thank you so much.
And we'd love to hear your stories, because I've learnt more about Dad today than I have in a long time. So if you'd like to share a memory on camera, do that. That would be great. We're going to put the video on YouTube afterwards. Thank you all so much for coming, especially if you've come from a long way. It's been fantastic to have you all here, and a great honour. Thank you.
I just wanted to share this little anecdote about how I first met Tony. I was driving a classic car one day and stopped for petrol at the Four Wentways service station, quite near where Tony lived. And I was just about to set off again when this very tall stranger came loping across the forecourt and accosted me and said, he said, have you read the road test on this car in the Motor magazine from 50 years ago? And I said, well, as it happens, yes, I have. And he said, jolly good, because I wrote it. Anyway, we became mates, and I'm delighted to be here today. I'm desperately sad that we've all lost this wonderful friend. So that's my little anecdote.
I used to be an avid reader of Motor magazine, and when Tony was on Motor magazine, he and Gordon Bruce co-drove a Ford RS2000, I think it was, on the A1 Motor Tour of Britain. I was pursuing this event in my souped-up Pullman Imp that I had with a hefty oil consumption. It had run out of oil. I saw these two chaps who I'd read about, read the words of many times, and I thought I'd introduce myself as an avid reader, and have they any oil they could let me have? And they very kindly gave me 2 pints of Shell oil after looking at each other saying, shall we, all right. And so that was great. That was the first time I met Tony. And the last time I met Tony, I was on my way to a press launch. I, by this time, had a car called a Sunbeam Stiletto, which is a tuned-up Pullman Imp. Tony used to run a long-term test on one of these on Motor magazine many years before I was on the magazine. And I thought I'd drop in to see him and Carys. And because I thought Tony might be interested to see this car that I had, was just the same as one that he used to run. I took him out on it. He was absolutely blown away. He said, I'd forgotten all about this car, I'd forgotten how modern it feels, and thank you so much for bringing it. And then he sent me an email next day saying, just to thank you very much for letting me have a go in this little car of yours, bring back long lost memories of great times. And that was the last time I ever saw him, so I thought that rather neatly bookended the times I knew Tony in 1973 and then 1920, whatever it was, about 3 or 4 years ago.
One of my special memories of Tony was when he very kindly offered to take my mum out in his Austin 7. My mum is about to be 95 now, but when she celebrated her 90th birthday, Tony very kindly drove over, picked up my mum and took her for a ride, but notoriously not before he popped into the pub and had a pint of Adnams. And then he took my mum out for a ride in the Austin 7. I had the pleasure of crowding in the back of the car with Carys on 1 or 2 occasions, and it was absolutely brilliant. And my claim to fame is that I am a very proud owner of a Tony Dron Lego man, which is my pride and joy. I should have bought it today, but he's on the shelf at home.
First heard about him in the 1970s, going to Birmingham on the trains as a bank clerk, thinking, I'm in the wrong job. And then, lo and behold, about 10 years or more ago, suddenly joined our local car club, which is the Austin 7, Cambridge Austin 7 Car Club, and couldn't believe that such a person would be. But getting into conversation with him, it was lovely hearing some of the anecdotes, and he was a contemporary of James Hunt and how they enjoyed life together. And then I attended one of his talks to the 750 Motor Club, and then did an article based on the talk with all the cars in it. And what a privilege for him to drive all these cars, and I was just chuffed that he would get to know me, call me by my Christian name, and I was just totally in awe of Tony and really delighted to be here and celebrate his life here today with everybody else.
So my memory of Tony. Everybody here knows Tony as being a racing driver. I know Tony as a bloke who comes to the pub in his Austin 7 and meets fellow Austin 7 owners and is happy as Larry.
Tony gave me some driver tuition. I wanted driver tuition because I got into some bad habits I felt in racing my Porsche 993 RS, which I was enjoying. I was going pretty quickly, doing really well, but I wasn't sure that it was actually quite good enough, and I don't race all the time, so I couldn't be as competitive as I thought I should be. So I called Tony and we met at Donington, and he took me around the car, and then I drove him around. And when I drove around, he didn't really say anything. We went in the pits and he said, "You just need to slow down a bit and you go much faster. You're braking too late. You should brake a little bit earlier, a little bit more gently, and you'll find yourself carrying more speed, more control, and you'll enjoy it more and you'll be faster." Of course he was right, and it sort of felt counterintuitive, but when you do it, it does feel right. And so Tony's expertise and his gentle way of telling me, guiding me, was just inspiring, and it was lovely, and we had a fantastic day, and it was really helpful, and I did go on to have more success with the car, and I'm just so glad I had that day with Tony, a fantastic gentleman. And Tony, if you're watching this, thanks again.
I got to know Tony very well through the Austin 7s. He was part of our Austin 7 Cambridge car club, Austin 7 Vintage Car Club. And I was really privileged because Tony, one day he said to me, he said, "It occurs to me that I've never invited you to come to the British Racing Drivers Club for lunch." So I was really excited about that. So he said, "Well, pick an event and we'll go along." So we picked some historic racing cars, and I came along with Tony and Caris, and we spent the day having lunch in the British Racing Drivers Club and watching the cars, and that was a real privilege. And we got to know Tony really, really well, and really enjoyed the time with him. So thanks, Tony, for all the time we had together. And thank you very much for the privilege of bringing me to the British Racing Drivers Club.
Probably the first memory I have of Tony's incredible abilities behind the wheel was when at Goodwood at the Festival of Speed he was ready to drive the Uhlenhaut Coupe, which is a tiny little filigree sports car driven by people who are about 5.5 foot tall. Tony was about 6.5 feet tall, and I couldn't imagine how he would get into the car and drive it, but he managed to fold himself up like a praying mantis almost, and he got behind the wheel, tore off up the hill at a pace that no other driver seemed to match that weekend. He was completely fearless and very happy to tuck himself into whatever needed to be tucked into.
I'd love to tell a quick story about my late great friend Tony Dron. I mean, I'd known Tony really in that sort of vicarious way where you know someone from magazines, and as a kid I'd read Thoroughbred and Classic Cars, so I was really familiar with Tony as the journalist, and of course Tony's driving exploits don't need mention by me, but some years ago I had the opportunity to do a race at the Nürburgring on the Nordschleife, and who better to ask to teach me the Nordschleife than Tony? And I thought we'd maybe spend a day there, but we didn't spend a day there. We visited the Nordschleife 3 times. We stayed at the Gasthaus Gillies. We enjoyed a few beverages at night, but Tony was absolutely incredible and insisted on walking the track, talking the track. And I learned so much, not just about the Nordschleife, but so much about Tony and so much about life and love. And you know, we had the opportunity to get Tony to join us to race at the Nürburgring, and I helped with Hugh McCaig to take Écurie Cost, the racing team, back there, and we entered the 24 Hours of Spa in a Group N BMW with Ian Donaldson. And again, you know, having Tony on board was just an honour and a privilege. It was an incredibly hot race. Unfortunately, the car broke its differential in the first
hour or so, and the plan had been to take in the car, a certain pace to get the car to the end of the 24 hours. So it was resolved around the back of the broken differential that if we got it back together, we would literally drive the car as though we stole it, and it would surely break, and we'd go home for dinner that night. Well, we drove the car like we stole it. Tony drove and drove and drove, and his performance was absolutely extraordinary. On Sunday afternoon, I got out the car and I went up to see how Tony was doing, because I knew he didn't have a stint, and I saw him sort of lying on the floor with Karis, and he looked absolutely wiped. And what we didn't know at the time was that was the start of Tony's health problems. But of course he got back in the car and he did another stint, and we came from car, I think, position 250 to 17th overall and 3rd in class, and it was just amazing. And Tony was fantastic, and I'll never forget that glint in his eye he could give you, and he helped me in so many different ways. I mean, he was a great friend. I was sat with him here in the BRDC just a few months ago at the AGM, and he carried himself with such dignity in his last years, but the glint in the eye never went. It was a privilege to have known him, and a privilege to share this story.
My main interaction with Tony was in my days working on Mercedes Enthusiast magazine, and a particularly memorable experience that kind of summed up both what a nice person Tony was and also what an incredibly skilled driver he was, particularly with older cars. It was a centenary celebration for the 1908 Dieppe Grand Prix, and I had the privilege of riding alongside Tony in this monstrous 1908 Benz, which we somehow navigated through busy traffic in Dieppe. Tony, if anyone has ever driven with him, will know he can be quite colourful in the way he describes fellow road users, and there was amusing descriptions of how he thought the French drivers around us were dealing with this brakeless monster that we were driving. But it was although it was funny, you could see he was taking it incredibly seriously, and the value of this car, the difficulty of driving it surrounded by other traffic, but all the time keeping up an entertaining banter and stream of stories, and it was just an absolutely fantastic experience. I'll treasure it for a long time, and I think it just summed up what a lovely person Tony was, but also what a skilled and passionate driver he was.
I first met Tony Dron in about 1969, and we became fairly good friends, and before terribly long we wound up racing Escort Mexicos together. He was generally near the front of the grid, I was somewhere below the middle. My particular memory of Escort racing with Dron was at Zolder in Belgium, when, after the first practice, much to my surprise, I was significantly ahead of him on the timing sheets. Feeling extremely smug about this, I walked up to him in the pits where he had his head under the bonnet and said, "Beat you there, mate." Tony looked up, looked at me, looked under the bonnet and said, "Yes, but it's all right. I've put the loose spark plug lead back on now." He'd been running on 3 cylinders.